Good morning. Good morning. And how is everyone doing today? So today, our plan is we're going to do a discussion framed around an issue presented in Charlotte Williams' article in the Pacific Rim Law and Policy Journal on adverse possession. And so if you'll give me just 1 minute, I will grab the question. Okay. Okay, so the question that we're going to be discussing is that adverse possession gives us a way to prevent violence over conflicting claims to land. So we're going to go into breakout rooms for just a few minutes. There's going to be one for the affirmative and one for the negative. You're going to sort of get together, bounce ideas off each other, get yourselves situated, and then we will reconvene and discuss. We'll hear from each side, and then we'll sort of do things a little more free-flowing at that point. So you're going to get to choose your rooms up to a point. And what I mean by that is the rooms have to be even. So there's 16 students in here, 8 go into the affirmative room, 8 go into the negative room. And you can choose. One thing that we have seen, we've seen a lot of times where students, Zoom is not giving you the functionality to choose a room. If that happens to you, just put in the chat or say via voice which side you want to be on, and as long as there are seats available in that room, I will go ahead and assign you to it. So that is another way to make that work. So So 4 in the affirmative, 5 in the 6 in the affirmative. Boy, you guys really don't like the negative. That's 7, and with Alyssa, that's it. Everybody else goes into the negative. There are too many people in the affirmative room. Hang on. Okay, so I appreciate uh, that the work that you guys did in the breakout rooms. Let me um, start by saying I know that there were a couple of folks who um, did not get into the breakout room that they wanted, and I apologize for that. It was first come, first serve, and you were a little, and there folks were faster than you were, so I apologize for that. Um, okay, so let's hear from our affirmative side first. Why do you think that adverse possession uh, is a way to prevent violence?
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So we had each had certain ideas. Um, so we basically agreed that a forced society would prevent violence over conflicting claims for should I just list them or should I try to go into detail about all of our points?
I mean, I think that that's really up to you. If you think that there's, I would encourage you to discuss, the logic behind sort of what you think are the most important
Okay.
points.
All right. So the first point that I thought was a really good point was that during his hold of the land, the adverse possessor may have had contracts or agreements or leases with other individuals in relation to use of the land. And by maintaining his hold, it would prevent tension under that route with the difficulties with the other individuals and their agreements. Um, that is not necessarily unfair because there are specific elements or maybe a certain threshold that the adverse possessor must first reach, like the time limit, like his intention, like the evidence and facts that the courts must actually consider before giving him claim to the land. So it's not an automatic process. Um, the other measures in this circumstances, and this given the background of Indonesia, had favored other groups more than one group, and because of the backdrop of conflicting rights, each individual had a right to the land. It would have been difficult for the court to just choose one person. The adverse possessor was more of a balanced route that could favor each group or each individual evenly. Um, I had said that it was a more efficient use of the land because the adverse possessor is the person who is currently using the land after it had been abandoned, had developed the land for whatever reason that they had, and it was obviously using it. So continuing with their use would have been a more efficient way to use it. And that I had noticed an argument, the humanitarian argument, that you're basically displacing somebody else from their own land. Um, but in this situation where more than one person has a right to land, somebody will lose out in any case. So that I don't believe there's basis to that argument. I want to say, and let me see if there's and I think that was the points we had discussed.
Okay, so let's hear from the negative, and let me preface this by saying that I think the negative has the harder time here because, as we just saw from Alyssa, um, the affirmative has the assigned reading sort of laying out an argument for you. The negative has to work off of a critique of that argument. So I think it's harder. So I don't expect the negative to be as polished or as well developed as the affirmative. Um, I'm delighted if you are, but you should not feel bad if you're not. So with that, let me hear from someone on the negative side. Anybody? Hello. Yeah, please,
Hello?
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you went back to mute.
Sorry. Okay. In regards to the negative, adverse possession essentially awards individuals to gain legal title for illegal activity. So it may begin to create a slippery slope, which encourages individuals to squat and hope to legally acquire land rather than going through the acceptable means of purchase. So, in other words, if I went through the strenuous process of gaining title and land, and I have to leave my country for whatever circumstances, whether it be forced or not, adverse possession is telling me that somebody can come and take claim over my land when I couldn't essentially do anything with it because I've been relocated somewhere or war broke out, or even though it's not common in a lot of today's society, we still have to take in consideration that a lot of countries still go through these things, and it's unfair that the land that has been inherited to them, like we see Aboriginals in Australia, that where their land gets taken away. So there isn't anything that prevents that. And then we can say with the law, their ignorance of the law is no excuse. However, what about persons who do not have the right to education or can afford an education to be able to properly educate themselves on what is titles and adverse possessions? These people are severely disadvantaged of this in regards to the system. So who is it essentially there to protect when persons who have a more higher social economic status knows all about this? However, poor people don't have that advantage. And then we also look at adverse possession creating more burden on landowners by imposing additional encumbrances on them and their use of land. So I've already gone through the strenuous process of claiming my land or buying my land, but you're telling me I also have to make sure that I keep up with this, that, and the third, make sure I pay my taxes on time, and so many other factors, when I felt like I've already done so much already. And then, of course, there are going to be days or times that the land isn't going to be cleared, garden, fenced, or I'm not going to take the time to do all of this extra that I should be doing, or you tell me that I should be doing. And then that encourages other people to say, well, because you didn't do that, somebody else has the right to take your land. It also creates a retroactive law in that if someone holds a fee simple failure to use or inhabit the land should not remove their ownership. But adverse possession gives way for someone to take it away that where they have legal interest.
Okay. So I really appreciate what I've heard from both sides, but I want to tell you what I'm not hearing from either side. I'm not hearing a connection between adverse possession and violence, right? So I've heard some really, I think, well structured and impassioned and well argued argument for why adverse possession is good or bad, right, as a policy choice, but I'm not hearing a specific connection to violence.
Well, I don't
So,
think
but-
it necessarily prevents violence, because when you look at it, if I have rifle, like say the people in Timor-Leste comes back somehow and tries to make claim on their land, but a squatter is saying, well, I have that land. What's preventing me from fighting for it? If I feel that this is my native land, this belongs to me, and because I was moved against my will, what's stopping me for wanting and fighting for something that my family has fought for in the past?
Mhm.
That I feel like that's rightfully mine.
So what do we think on the affirmative side? What do we hear? What do we think about what we hear from Louisiana? And more broadly, how do we what do you think specifically about the question that's before the House, right? The relationship between adverse possession and reducing or preventing violence over conflicting claims to land.
In my opinion, I believe that the confusion as to who has the right to land, everybody has the right to land in itself, give rise to more violence. Each person feels they have a right to the land, that they should have make use of the land. I've been here since the war. I didn't know who was here before or what's not. It was just abandoned land. I have a right to the land, or as Louisiana had argued, it was my land before. I did not want to leave. I was forced to leave. So that confusion, I see, in my opinion, gives rise to the violence. And if there was to be a settled an argument that says, or well, maybe a measure that says, this land is this person's, there will be less confusion. You have less feeling that you need to fight for your land, in my opinion.
So as I understand Alyssa's argument, and Alyssa, you should jump in and tell me if I'm wrong. The concern here for the affirmative is that in the specific case of Timor-Leste, and right in other situations as well, you may have more than one person who has a legitimate claim to the land because different legal regimes were issuing title to different people. And as I understand the affirmative, the idea is that adverse possession gives us a way, a principled way to adjudicate these conflicting claims without resort to self-help, and in a way that that doesn't require us to pick winners and losers on an arbitrary basis, right? There's some sort of rational basis for determining who the winner is. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Yes, please.
Now,
That's what I was thinking.
what I'm hearing from Louisiana is an argument that, but there's going to be losers, and these losers, there's going to be people who are being dispossessed, and they may choose to engage in self-help even in the face of an adverse judgment, right? Is that, Louisiana, am I understanding your argument?
Yes.
Okay. So what do we think about these stances, right? It would be nice to hear from some additional folks. I'm not going to force you guys to talk, but that would be nice. So Nicole first, and then Perry.
So I think even from the article, it seems as though the legal doctrine of adverse possession is being put over as this neutral, objective way of deciding conflict when it's not, because you have to meet the requirements. So it's assuming that there are people out there who will meet the requirements. They know what the requirements are. They're in a position to meet the requirements. And also that we could very well say your title before doesn't matter, and that will be okay. I just don't think that violence will be resolved in that way, because there will be people who feel disgruntled about it. And so it's not a neutral, you can't start from adverse possession and say everything that happened before doesn't matter. It's not a neutral way of arbitrating conflicting titles.
I agree with everything you said. I just want to amplify one thing, which is that you can write an adverse possession law to sort of create whatever requirements you want to impose. And so adverse possession does not have to follow the model that we talked about in class, right? The chain model. It does not have to follow the factual possession and adverse intent model that is outlined in the cases. You can write it so that, as of this date, right? Whatever the date is, and you can put it in the past so that there's not an incentive to fight once the law is passed. But after this date, whoever's in possession of the land is the title owner, right? And you can just sort of wipe the slate clean and say, we're going to start over from scratch and issue new titles, and here endeth the conversation, right? That is a choice that you can make. Beyond that, I agree with everything you're saying, that adverse possession isn't necessarily neutral, right? There was another tutorial earlier in the week where someone, Nicole, you're muted. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm listening to you, sir.
Okay, sorry. The highlight moved to your avatar, and I thought you were saying something. There was someone in another tutorial who pointed out that in the specific case of Timor-Leste, right, this is a very colonialist approach, right, to saying that, you know, we have to bring in this Western tool to fix this mess created by colonialism. And I think that's a really powerful comment, and I think that's one that this faculty in particular takes seriously, right? The notion that indigenous communities and non-Western communities should have the ability to use non-Western solutions to solve their own problems, right? So, sorry, I did not mean to go on for so long. Perry, you had your hand up. Go ahead. Perry.
Sir, could let Karina go ahead?
Okay, Corinna, go ahead.
All right. So, based on my understanding of Louisiana's argument, she's saying, as you said, that there are going to be losers. So my question is, why can't the losers be the adverse possessors? Further than that, which approach is better? Would they prefer for us to not have a system at all and have growing tensions, or would they prefer the law to put a system in place with mechanisms to try to regulate the issues, with the appreciation that these regulations are surrounding human beings, so tensions will be there either way? Would the preference be that we have no regulations at all and the tensions continue to rise, the violence continues to rise, or would they want the law to try and step in and regulate those tensions? Because the question itself says, let me find the question. Adverse possession doctrine affords societies a way to prevent, not the way to eliminate, but a way to prevent or mitigate violence over conflicting claims to land. It's unlikely, as the author said in her article, that any policy would be fully able to eliminate disputes, but this just adds the structure that I think the law needs.
And I think that's a really important point, right? In that allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good is a frequent failure in policymaking, right? Insisting that we can't improve a situation unless we can fix every problem with it is usually an argument in defense of the status quo. And it suggests that the current level of misery is better than a lower level of misery. And I think the other point that Corinna raises that I think is really important here is that under the status quo in Timor-Leste, right, you have multiple owners who have lawful claims because the incoming, new legal regimes did not wipe out prior regimes, right? The Indonesians didn't wipe away the Portuguese legal regime, they built over it. And then when the UN came in after the Indonesian withdrawal, their regime did not replace Indonesian title, right? It was built over it, and so on and so forth. And so you have multiple people with legitimate lawful claims. And when violence breaks out over that, the state does not know, the state doesn't have a principled way to decide whose claim is legitimate. But if there's a mechanism, if there is a law that provides for this is the winner and this is the loser, it doesn't have to be adverse possession. It can, the legislature could decide that we're going to award title to those who hold under the Portuguese regime or under indigenous title or under Indonesian title, right? They can make that decision. But if they choose an adverse possession regime, then if violence breaks out, if the losers under that regime engage in violence, the state now knows how to respond, right? There's a clear person with a right to the property. So I think, this is what I mean when I say I think the negative has a really hard job here. But let me ask a question that I think may help the negative, which is, what evidence do we have that adverse possession will solve this at all? Go ahead, Nicole.
Well, yeah, that's the point that I was going to make, sir, because the thing is that when you're at ground zero, anything is better than ground zero, right? But okay, so you can make the argument that adverse possession is better than the status quo, but how do we know that some other legislative measure is not better than adverse possession? If we have to go through this trial and error, well, that in itself leads to unpredictability, it leads to instability, it leads to chaos, and the whole objective of preventing violence can also be defeated that way, even though sometimes that's how society progresses.
Now, I do agree that policymaking is different from like a student union debate, right? Because in policymaking, Nicole, you're absolutely right that we should be considering all the alternatives and trying to figure out what's the best alternative. In something that's structured like this, the question that's before the House is before the House, and alternatives are not before the House. So the alternatives are adverse possession and the status quo. But I think the question that I'm asking is really about, in order for an adverse possession law to be effective, right? The legislature does not have the capacity. I've never seen a legislature with the capacity to actually go down to the level of individual parcels and declare this person has good title, all other titles are defeated, right? The legislature generates a mechanism and then delegates the decision making to either an administrative agency or to the judiciary. And do we think that, looking specifically at the case of Timor-Leste, do we think that those institutions have the capacity to render decisions that will be treated, that will be given legitimacy?
Well, for me, no, because I mean, what the author was saying a lot throughout the article is that the judicial system in the country is basically ineffective. It's now trying to develop the capacity. So even if if they're able to institute some legislation regarding adverse possession, how do we even know that that will be managed? And then disputes regarding that, will they be resolved? How will they be resolved? Because it requires the judicial system to function and to have the capacity to function. You can't just say, well, here's the law. Because if you can't implement, if you can't adjudicate, well, then you just have a law and conflicts will not be resolved.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly the point. That I think is one of the stronger arguments against the question, right? Is that adverse possession doesn't fix anything without the institutional capacity to implement it. And in the specific case of Timor-Leste, right, we do not have that institutional capacity. But let's talk about a case a little bit closer to home where there's something a little bit similar, but it's different, and the institutional constraints are different and whatnot. And let's talk about the case of Montserrat. Okay, so as I'm sure you guys are well aware, I only learned about it very recently. 2/3 of the island of Montserrat is uninhabitable. And that only occurred about 25 years ago. So there's all these people who are still alive, the vast majority of whom have fled to the United Kingdom, who own land in Montserrat that they can't access, that they can't use. But the day is going to come when the experts say that we can go back to into the exclusion zone, that the volcano has quieted down. And my question then, right, if it's 5 years from now, probably most title owners are ascertainable. If it's 20 years from now, maybe it's a little harder. If it's 100 years from now, how do we determine who can make use of and own all of this land? This one's a little tricky, right? Because it changes the context a little bit, because Montserrat has English judges and English law. So there's a lot more institutional capacity than in Timor-Leste. But there's still the issue of how do we determine what the just result here is? If it's 100 years from now before people can go back, and go ahead, Tricia. Go ahead. You came off mute. Did you have something? Go ahead.
No, yeah, but sir, but before they had the volcanic activity, didn't they have I just said they have the English system, so I assume they will have a land registry with the names of the people who own the titles and everything. So would it not be held like kept safely? So whether it's 5 years from now or 100 years from now, my great grandchildren or my great great grandchildren should be able to come and take possession of the land. I don't think it should be a big dispute, no matter how many years, because once I lived there before the volcanic activity, and I had deeds and title to the land, and they're supposed to have a registry. Whether it is 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 100 years, it should be kept in my family. Can that not work?
I mean, we can hope that it works, right? That certainly, you're certainly describing the way that it should work. But like, if we think back to Timor-Leste, right? The Indonesians burned the land records as they withdrew, and so and you know, in Montserrat, the capital of the island is actually in the exclusion zone, so the records may have been destroyed. So there may be a problem where, yes, if the records were maintained, then everything's fine, but they may not have been maintained. And so we're out of time. So I just want to sort of leave you with this to think about. And it's not a big deal one way or the other, so do not spend a lot of time thinking about it. But I really want to say that I appreciate your engagement today and your hard work. It's very evident that you guys sort of cracked into the article, and I really appreciate that. So I will see you guys tomorrow. Take care, and bye.